Hello, everyone.
His words echoed in my mind like a forbidden whisper I couldn't shake off. No matter how hard I tried to focus on something else, it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his intense gaze, those moments when we were alone and the air between us felt heavier. It wasn't supposed to feel like this, but it did. And I hated how much I liked it. It started a week ago. My mom had invited me to spend a few days at their countryside house. I didn't think much of it, just a quiet getaway from the city, a chance to clear my head. But what I didn't expect was him, Alex. My mom's new husband's son. My stepbrother. We weren't close before, barely knew each other, and I figured this visit would be no different. Yet, from the moment I arrived, something felt off. Alex wasn't like I remembered. He wasn't that awkward guy standing quietly in the corner during family gatherings. He had changed. There was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself, and his eyes. God, those eyes. They weren't just looking at me, they were looking through me, as if he could see every thought I was trying to hide. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I was overthinking. But that night, everything shifted. It was late, and the house was quiet. Everyone had gone to bed, and I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I opened the fridge, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Alex. I could feel his presence before he even spoke. "You couldn't sleep either?" His voice was calm, casual, but something about the way he said it made my heart race. "Yeah, just thirsty," I said, hoping he wouldn't notice the tremor in my voice. I turned around, and that's when I saw it, that look. His eyes locked onto mine, and suddenly, the air felt too thick to breathe. There was no mistaking it anymore. This wasn't just in my head. There was something real happening between us, something neither of us was ready to admit. "Why do you keep looking at me like that?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Because I can't help it," he said, taking a step closer. "You're different. You're not like anyone else." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. My instinct was to laugh it off, to make a joke and walk away. But I couldn't move. Something in the way he looked at me kept me frozen in place, and before I knew it, he was standing inches away from me. "You should go to bed," I said, trying to sound firm, but even I didn't believe my own words. "Maybe I should," he replied, his voice low, almost teasing. "But I don't want to." For a second, time seemed to stop. The only thing I could hear was my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I knew I should walk away, end this before it went any further, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there, caught between what I knew was right and what I secretly wanted. And then, as quickly as it started, he stepped back, breaking the tension. "Good night," he said, his lips curling into a faint smile before he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, breathless and confused. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed that moment in my head, the way he looked at me, the way his voice sent shivers down my spine. I hated how much I was thinking about him, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing. Just a late-night moment that didn't mean anything. But as the day went on, it became clear that Alex wasn't going to make it easy for me to forget. He didn't say anything outright, but the way he watched me, the way his presence lingered whenever we were in the same room, made it impossible to ignore. By the third day, I was a mess. I couldn't figure out what was happening between us, and worse, I couldn't figure out how to stop it. Part of me wanted to confront him, to tell him to back off, but another part of me, one I wasn't proud of, wanted to see just how far this would go. That night, it happened again. Everyone had gone to bed early, and I was lying on the couch in the living room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, when Alex walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down on the other end of the couch, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body but not close enough to touch. "You don't mind if I sit here, do you?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes anything but. Suit yourself, I said, pretending not to care, though my heart was already racing. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the soft hum of the TV in the background. I tried to focus on the screen, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting. You're really going to pretend like nothing's happening, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I don't know what you're talking about, I lied, my voice too defensive to be convincing. He leaned in slightly, just enough to close the distance between us. You feel it too, don't you? He said softly, his eyes searching mine. I wanted to deny it, to push him away and put an end to whatever this was. But I couldn't. Because he was right, I did feel it. And as much as I hated to admit it, I didn't want it to stop. I don't know what you're trying to do, I said quietly, my voice shaking. I'm not trying to do anything, he said, his voice steady. I just want to be honest about what's happening. Don't you? Honest. That word hit me harder than I expected. Because the truth was, I hadn't been honest, with him or with myself. I had spent days pretending that this was nothing, that I didn't feel the same pull he did. But now, sitting here with him, so close I could feel his breath on my skin, I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. I don't know, I admitted, barely able to get the words out. That's okay, he said, his voice gentle. We don't have to figure it out right now. I just wanted you to know that you're not alone in this. There was something about the way he said it, something so sincere, that made it impossible to stay angry. I didn't know what was happening between us, but in that moment, I didn't care. All I knew was that things were about to get a lot more complicated. And I couldn't wait to see what happened next. After that night, the tension between us only grew stronger. I tried to keep my distance, but it felt impossible. Alex acted as if nothing had happened, like we were still just two people stuck in the same house for a few days. But his eyes, they told a completely different story. Every glance he gave me felt like a silent conversation, one that only the two of us could hear. I didn't want to admit it, but every time I caught him looking at me, something inside stirred, something I wasn't ready to face. I tried convincing myself that it was all in my head, that I was reading too much into it. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more obvious it became. One afternoon, I was walking down the hall after taking a shower. I hadn't expected anyone to be around, so I was caught off guard when I saw Alex standing there, leaning casually against the wall. His eyes flicked over me quickly, but that one glance was enough to send my heart into overdrive. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching me with that same unreadable expression. Did you need something? I asked, trying to sound calm, even though my pulse was racing. Just wanted to see you, he said with a small, mysterious smile. His words hung in the air, making it hard to breathe. I could have told him to stop, to leave me alone. It would have been so easy to end whatever this was before it went any further. But I didn't. Something held me back, something I didn't fully understand yet. That night, alone in my room, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he looked at me. It wasn't just attraction, it was something deeper, something that made me feel vulnerable in a way I wasn't used to. I hated how much space he was taking up in my mind, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push him out. The next few days were a strange dance between us. He never crossed any obvious lines, but every interaction felt charged, as if we were teetering on the edge of something dangerous. During meals, his eyes would meet mine across the table, lingering just a little too long. In the living room, he'd sit just close enough that I could feel the heat of his body, but not close enough to call him out on it. It was driving me insane. The more I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, the more I realized it wasn't. One evening, I decided to confront him, not because I wanted to end it, but because I needed to understand what was happening. I found him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, sipping a glass of water. He looked up as I entered, his expression calm but curious. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, standing a few feet away from him. "Doing what?" he said, setting down the glass. His tone was casual, but there was a spark in his eyes, like he knew exactly what I meant. You know what? I said, crossing my arms over my chest. You keep looking at me like that, acting like there's something between us. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step toward me, closing the distance between us. Maybe because there is something between us, he said quietly, his voice low and steady. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My mind was racing, trying to come up with something, anything, that would make sense of what I was feeling. But nothing did. Look, he said, taking another step closer, if you want me to stop, just say the word, and I will. But don't pretend you don't feel it too. His words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that whatever I was feeling didn't matter. But I couldn't. Because he was right, I did feel it too. And as much as I hated to admit it, part of me didn't want him to stop. You shouldn't be saying things like that, I said quietly, looking away. But you didn't tell me to stop, he pointed out, his voice soft but insistent. I didn't have an answer for that. All I knew was that every time he got close, it became harder to think clearly. The lines between right and wrong were starting to blur, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending that nothing was happening. Good night, Alex, I said finally, turning to leave before things could go any further. Good night, he replied, but his voice carried a weight that made it clear this wasn't over. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversation over and over in my mind. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something I couldn't take back. I wasn't ready to admit it out loud, but deep down, I knew. Whatever was happening between us was real, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. By the third day, things had taken a turn I wasn't prepared for. My mom and her husband left for the city, which meant Alex and I were alone in the house. It was quiet, too quiet. That kind of silence that amplifies every little sound, every breath, and, most of all, the tension hanging between us. I tried to keep myself busy, to ignore the growing restlessness inside me, but it was useless. The weight of everything unsaid lingered in the air, making it impossible to focus on anything for too long. Maybe you want to watch a movie? Alex's voice startled me out of my thoughts. He was standing in my doorway, leaning casually against the frame, looking way too comfortable. Sure, I said, pretending to be indifferent, though every instinct told me this was a terrible idea. I followed him into the living room, where he picked out a movie and settled on the couch. I hesitated for a moment before sitting down next to him. At first, there was a safe distance between us, but as the minutes passed, that distance seemed to shrink. Neither of us moved, but somehow, we kept getting closer. The movie played on, but I barely paid attention. My mind was too occupied with the fact that Alex was sitting so close, his arm resting on the back of the couch, just inches from my shoulder. I could feel the warmth of his body radiating toward me, and it was driving me insane. Then it happened. His hand, which had been resting on his thigh, shifted slightly until it was next to mine. He didn't touch me at first, just let his fingers hover near mine, close enough that I could feel the heat. My heart pounded in my chest, loud enough that I was sure he could hear it. I should have moved. I should have pulled away, created some space between us. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed perfectly still, as if waiting to see what he would do next. Slowly, tentatively, his fingers brushed against mine. It was the lightest touch, barely there, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, but he was focused on the screen, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. That simple touch had crossed a line I wasn't sure we could come back from. You okay? He asked, his voice low and calm, as if he wasn't aware of the chaos he was causing inside me. Yeah, I lied, though my voice came out softer than I intended. For a few more minutes, we sat like that, our fingers barely touching, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. Every second felt like an eternity, and I couldn't tell if I wanted him to stop or if I wanted him to keep going. And then he did something that made my breath catch. He shifted closer, closing the remaining distance between us until our shoulders were touching. His arm slipped from the back of the couch to rest behind me, and I felt his fingers lightly graze the back of my neck. It was too much. The heat, the tension, the way his touch made my skin tingle, it was overwhelming. I turned to him, ready to say something, anything that would break the spell he had cast over me. But the words died in my throat when I met his gaze. His eyes were darker than usual, filled with something I couldn't quite name but felt deep in my core. There was no mistaking what was happening between us now. It wasn't just tension, it was desire, raw and undeniable. "We should stop," I said quietly, though even as I said it, I didn't move away. "Do you really want me to?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth to answer, but I couldn't find the words. Because the truth was, I didn't want him to stop. Not really. And that terrified me more than anything. Before I could say anything, he leaned in slightly, close enough that I could feel his breath against my skin. My heart raced, and for a moment, I thought he was going to kiss me. I wasn't sure if I wanted him to or if I wanted to run. But he didn't. Instead, he pulled back just enough to leave me breathless, hanging on the edge of something I wasn't ready to fall into yet. "I'll wait," he said softly, his eyes never leaving mine. "But don't pretend you don't want this too." With that, he stood up, leaving me sitting there, stunned and confused. I watched him walk away, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. I should have felt relieved that he didn't push things further. I should have been grateful that he gave me space to think. But instead, all I felt was frustration that I had wanted him to keep going, frustration that I couldn't admit it out loud. I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Whatever was happening between us wasn't going to go away. And worse, I wasn't sure I wanted it to. The whole day, I tried my best to keep my distance from Alex. I told myself that if I avoided him, if I stayed busy enough, maybe I could get through this without losing control. But it was pointless. The tension between us didn't fade, it grew stronger, like a storm brewing on the horizon, inevitable and unstoppable. Every glance we exchanged felt loaded, charged with an unspoken understanding neither of us dared to acknowledge out loud. Even when we weren't in the same room, I could feel him, like a shadow in the back of my mind, always there, always watching. By evening, I was exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. I had spent hours fighting a battle I knew I was losing. So when Alex walked into the living room and sat down beside me on the couch, I didn't even bother pretending that I wasn't affected by his presence. I kept my eyes glued to my phone, scrolling through the screen in a futile attempt to distract myself. But it didn't work. I could feel the heat of him sitting so close, the way his gaze lingered on me, and it made it impossible to focus on anything else. "What do you want from me, Alex?" I asked finally, my voice low but steady. I didn't look at him, afraid of what I might see in his eyes if I did. "I just want to be near you," he said, his voice calm, but there was something in the way he said it that made my pulse quicken. I felt him shift closer, the couch dipping slightly under his weight. A second later, his hand brushed lightly against my shoulder. The touch was so soft it could have been accidental, but we both knew it wasn't. I tensed, every muscle in my body on high alert. I could have moved away. I could have told him to stop. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed right where I was, letting the tension between us build. "This is a bad idea," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "If it's such a bad idea, why aren't you pushing me away?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. I didn't have an answer. Because the truth was, I didn't want to push him away. I didn't want him to stop. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't deny it any longer. There was a part of me that wanted this, that had been wanting this for days. He reached up, his fingers brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. The simple gesture sent a shiver down my spine, and I hated how much I liked it. "Alex." I started, but I didn't know what to say. His name hung in the air between us, heavy with everything I wasn't ready to admit. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly, his fingers lingering on my cheek for a moment before dropping to his side. I just needed to know if I was the only one feeling this. You're not, I admitted before I could stop myself. The words slipped out, unbidden but true. And once they were out, there was no taking them back. The silence that followed was deafening. We both knew what this meant, what we were on the verge of. The line we were about to cross wasn't just thin, it was non-existent. You're overthinking it, he said after a moment, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Sometimes you just have to stop thinking and let yourself feel. His words hit me harder than I expected. Because he was right, I was overthinking it. I had spent days trying to rationalize something that couldn't be rationalized. And now, sitting here with him, so close I could feel the warmth of his body, I didn't want to think anymore. I just wanted to feel. Without thinking, I turned toward him, closing the small distance between us. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The tension was unbearable, like a coiled spring ready to snap. He leaned in slightly, and I found myself doing the same. Our faces were inches apart, close enough that I could feel his breath on my skin. My heart was racing, and every instinct told me to pull back, to stop this before it went too far. But I didn't. I couldn't. Tell me to stop, he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. And I will. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Because the truth was, I didn't want him to stop. I wanted him to keep going, to close the remaining distance between us and erase any doubt about where this was heading. But then, just as our lips were about to meet, something stopped me. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the last shred of logic clinging to the edge of my mind. Whatever it was, I pulled back at the last second, breaking the spell. I can't, I said, my voice trembling. Not yet. He didn't look angry or disappointed. Instead, he just nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. I can wait, he said, his voice calm but full of meaning. But don't pretend you don't want this too. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because he was right, I did want this. More than I wanted to admit, even to myself. We sat there in silence for a while longer, the tension still thick in the air, but somehow different now. It wasn't about whether or not this would happen anymore, it was about when. Eventually, Alex stood up, giving me one last lingering look before walking away. I stayed on the couch, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. I knew things between us had changed, that we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. And as much as I tried to convince myself that this was a mistake, that we needed to stop before it went any further, a part of me knew it was already too late. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted it to be. Because as much as I hated to admit it, I wanted him. And I knew that sooner or later, I was going to give in. The moment was thick, like honey, every touch and every glance crossing forbidden boundaries. Alex reached out, gently brushing his fingers against my strawberry, his touch warm enough to ignite something dangerous inside me. I didn't stop him, I just took a deep breath, trying to calm the wild beating of my heart. This is wrong, I whispered, though even I didn't believe the words anymore. He didn't say anything. He just smiled silently, leaning closer, his fingertips tracing softly along my peaches. A wave of warmth spread through my body, and my mind grew foggy, unable to focus on anything but him. The world beyond this room faded away, leaving only us, where what was forbidden had now become irresistible. If you want me to stop, just say so, he murmured, his hand moving in a way that made my insides turn upside down. But I didn't say anything. Instead, I grabbed his hand and pulled him closer, giving him no chance to retreat. The intensity was overwhelming, leaving no room for thoughts of right or wrong. His touch grew more confident, as if he was rediscovering every inch of me, his fingers tracing every curve. I felt him press against me, his warm breath skimming my neck, making me close my eyes and surrender completely to the moment. You have such juicy peaches, he whispered, his hands moving lower, making it impossible for me to hold back. I exhaled softly, allowing myself to forget everything else. We didn't need words, just actions, becoming bolder by the second. At one point, I felt his banana pressed against me, firm and ready. Without thinking, I grabbed it gently with my hands, realizing there was no turning back anymore. It happened suddenly, like a summer storm, fast, unexpected, but exactly what was needed in that moment. After it was over, we lay there silently, breathing heavily. I stared at the ceiling, trying to comprehend what had just happened. My whole body felt like it was on fire, but there was no guilt, only a strange satisfaction, a quiet joy that I had finally allowed myself to do what I wanted. "Do you regret it?" he asked, propping himself up on one elbow, his eyes curious but calm. "No," I replied, turning to face him. "But things will be different now." I got up and returned to my room, hoping the night would bury my chaotic thoughts. But even the next morning, when Mom returned home, I couldn't stop thinking about his touch, his gaze. It felt like an invisible bond had formed between us, one that no one could break. But Mom noticed something. Her eyes scanned me in a way that made my stomach drop. There was something in her gaze, something sharp, something knowing. "We need to talk," she said, her voice cold and firm, when Alex walked out of the kitchen. Her tone was like a verdict, calm, clear, and final. She knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to understand that something forbidden had happened. My anxiety turned into fear when she added, "I know what's going on between you two. You think I wouldn't notice?" The next day, she made Alex pack his things and announced that he would be staying with his father for a few months. It was her solution, her way of tearing apart what had barely started. I stood by the window, watching as he got into the car, feeling something tighten painfully inside me. I wanted him to stay. I wanted to relive that night again. And the scariest part was knowing that this wasn't the end. "This isn't over," I thought, watching his car disappear over the horizon, leaving me alone with the chaos we'd created.
Bye.